couple more minutes um, so that they can join us, but we'll get started pretty quickly because we've got 3 presentations. We want to make sure we give everybody enough time, but we appreciate you all hanging in there with us and joining for all 3 of these seminars. I've learned a lot. After the last meeting, we all kind of realized that we're all kind of geeking out over all the knowledge. So it's very exciting, and we appreciate you all sharing it.
All right, so without further ado, we're going to go ahead and start with our first presenter, Ty Lindsay from Louisiana. Ty, go ahead and take a moment to make sure you've got screen sharing permissions. I actually need to do that here on my end. You should be able to do that, and whatever else you need. So go ahead and get started when you're ready.
All right. Thank you. I know we're all kind of crunched for time, so I will try to be as brief as I can, get some information across. I am Ty Lindsay, Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries. I am one of the biologist program managers here that deal with a variety of things, but oyster is a big component of it, particularly reef construction. So just a brief history of our department. Oysters mean so much to this state that the Department of Wildlife and Fisheries actually started off as the Louisiana Oyster Commission over 100 years ago. And from there, it morphed into what it is today. We have about 1.6 million acres public grounds that we manage. Now, that is not to say that 1.6 million is productive, but that is the amount of acres we have to work with. We refer to them as the public oyster seed grounds in general, although there are reservations and areas and things like that. In addition to that, we have about another 400-something thousand acres of private oyster leases. Again, not to say that every one of them is productive, but that is the acreage of leases we have out now. And we have about 800 leaseholder accounts that manage those 400,000 acres. Typically, or normally, Louisiana has been the largest contributor to commercial oyster landings in the country for any species. Just to give you somewhat of a visual, we're in the gray and bar and all these. And we have gone down in some years, it's obvious. 2010 went down because of a BP oil spill, but generally the state has contributed very much to the commercial landings for the whole country. I'm going to start really with culch planting because we're pertaining to reef construction for our state. Our traditional culch plants are by far the biggest component. We have no dedicated staff for that. I, as well as Denise Kinsey and Christy McDonough, and we all take care of making these things happen. The frequency is all about funding. Most of it's coming from the feds by way of natural disasters down here. So hurricanes, some of the hurricanes will stimulate some funding from relief money from the feds that we are allocated to oyster rehabilitation. We also are currently, right now, we're using money from the BP or Deepwater Horizon oil spill. Even though that was 12 years ago, the money has just now started to come in. So that's where most of it comes. We generate some money from the state through compensation to our public grounds from oil and gas activities, for example. But I recall my 15 years here, only once or twice have we had any sufficient funds on our own to construct much of a culch plant. But the prices have gone up so much, we would construct something very, very small if we depended on our state funds only. When we're building a culch plant, the site selection, it's everything you would imagine. We go in what we already know about our grounds. Each area, we have 5 different basins. All of them have their own field offices, and that's all they do is sample those basins. So you have a lot of institutional knowledge about what's productive, where they see boats harvest, etc. We get a lot of information from independent sampling, particularly dredge, which is the bulk of what we do, dredge sampling. So again, we also, in some cases, I remember well that our field offices would plot where they saw boats harvesting during the seasons, and we could use that information. Now, that's not a widespread tool, but it was something that was pretty neat that we've used. We also do water bottom surveys if we have the money. Right now, we've got BP money, so we do a lot. We've done well over 700,000 acres worth of surveying since 2000. We're doing a lot more surveying now in the last year or two. We just did over 15,000 acres in Calcasieu Lake. Other components or considerations are obviously hydrology, and then future influences such as fresh water. Now, fresh water means it could be floods, it could be freshwater diversions, which is a big topic down here for coastal restoration, and also oil and gas activity to some extent. Most of them they work around us to the other way. We also consider, of course, marine traffic, the location, and on occasion we'll have restrictions on where we can build based on the funding that's available. Not usually the case, but we do have some. Some will tell us what body of water they want it in. Some will give us a basin, but generally we can put it anywhere we want. When we construct a gulch plant, which we have done about 20 of them since 2007, including one this year we just finished up in Drum Bay. They're mostly going to be the same. They're all going to be on public grounds. We don't put gulch plants anywhere but the public grounds that we can manage. Up to 400 acres of the last year or two, including Drum Bay, was about 200 acres average because of the cost. We're planting anywhere from 23,000 up to 35,000 cubic yards of material. The last 2 we did, Drum Bay included, was about 29,000. Average, most of the time, most common would be limestone, generally a 57 size, which is 2 to 4. We'll say those don't really match up, but you order 57, you get 72 to 4 inches. So that's about what happens. We have done some crushed concrete. I can't really say it's not any less effective. The problem we had with the 2 plants that I can recall using crushed limestone, crushed concrete, was cleanliness. There was substantial junk and mixed in with both of those plants, a lot. There was sticks, there was visqueen, there was even the orange perforated construction barrier fence. That's pieces of that were in there. So much so that we had the contractor hire oyster skimmers to go, sorry about that, shrimp trawlers to go out and skim the surface of the water to collect all that trash. It was quite a bit. So because of that, I personally don't like to deal with it. But so most of ours is clean limestone. We don't have a certain method of how we go about filling in the acreage with material. We just tell them to use high pressure water cannon and just circle around through there. There's no, crisscrossing. I mean, there's no pattern to it. Just basically put the material in that area. On occasion, we've done drag line. Drag line is just very rare for us. We got into, probably shouldn't say this, but several years ago, it got into like a competition with other states that they were getting more acreage of reef than we were for the same kind of money. So we had to do away with a lot of drag line just to compete in this so-called competition. because when you use drag line, at least down here, you get a lot less acreage. You get a lot more relief, but you don't get the acreage coverage. So that was really the only reason. Plus, we only have one contractor that deals with that. It usually results anywhere from 2 inches to maybe a foot of material, doing it with a spray. And we do plant over and adjacent to live reefs. That doesn't sound good, but it has always done very well for us. Whatever you bury, you end up doing, you get back. All the work is done by contractors through a bid out process. We also do some spat on shell, which we do in state. It's run through our hatchery down in Grand Isle. We have had some inconsistent production, limited practice because of that. We mostly put it on our brood reefs. Monitoring has shown that it is durable, so we'll keep going, but it's difficult to show that the impact of it. We're hoping we have a contract producing genetic marking, but that hasn't actually gotten started yet. We hope to be able to show genetically the impact of spat on shell. There is a separate program that does some spat on culch on private leases and some artificial reefs, but we don't employ that greatly in public grounds. We monitor our culch plants. We're using in-house staff. We do 1/4 meter for about 2 years, and then we increase to a full meter, and we quit doing it so frequently. Some of our culch plants, particularly the BP, they have specific monitoring they want to see, so they're a little bit different. Our regular oyster sampling of our grounds, as I said, mostly dredge work, again done in-house. We do quite a bit, as you can see. We do that every month except July. In July, we switch over to square meters to do our annual stock assessment, which I call OSA. That's what we base our seasons on. The seasons, our commission sets those. That's based on that stock assessment we do, a shell budget model to some degree, rotational opening schedule that's kind of loose, industry input. The industry does get a say so in what their seasons are going to be, which generally open in September. Limited basis sometimes, and then close it. Everything is done by the end of April. Most things don't last to the end of the year, but SAC limits is one of the ways we manage. We usually have a SAC limit per vessel per day, and then we allow in Calcasieu Lake is tonging and hand harvest only. They can't use any dredges. The only thing I wanted to point out here was there was a question. I was trying to answer all the questions the best I could that were posed, and that the access is open to anyone, but this is just to give you an idea of what kind of licenses they need just to fish the public grounds. Now, this is not same for private leases, but this is the layer of licenses permits you need to get onto the public grounds. Those fees are residential fees, and the non-residents are 4 times that much. Private leases, we don't manage any harvest on those. They can fish year round if they want to, as long as it is open. That area is open by our health department that will close things based on water quality data for seasonal closures. So predictable changes, but also flooding and storms cause some temporary closures. And they actually use a Calcasieu River gauge height to manage Calcasieu Lake. And also, of course, if there's an outbreak of illness associated, then they close that down. The rules are pretty much the same for AOC as far as control goes. Just to give you an idea of the trend, orange is the private lease landings, and the green one approaching 0 is off the public grounds. As far as the contribution goes, it has been, as you can see, going further and further to private. Public is almost non-existent. We don't have the resource we used to. So we've been very limited in what we do open. So really have the opportunity to fish like they used to years ago. But even if they do, they don't get a lot. But that's generally how it's been going. Private leases toe the line. Brooderies is new to us. We call them sanctuaries. We've done 4. We did them all last year. We use the same criteria and methods to decide where to put those. These 4 were all by BP funds. We're using 10-acre plots, filling in what we can as money becomes available. We worried about relief more than we worried about acreage on these, trying to overcome any hypoxia problems. We use limestone again, but we use bigger ones, bigger pieces, at least 18 inches. I think really what happened is we got 18 and bigger, but the real idea behind it was because even though it's harvest of oysters is prohibited by law, you kind of have to encourage them to follow the law. So the way we did it was, one of the methods was to make the material so big that culling the oysters off of them would be would disparage the idea of taking it illegally. We have our official reef program. The primary purpose for that program, which is separate outside of the oyster program, is finfish, but they do obviously attract oysters. Those are protected from oyster harvest as well. Finfish is fine. Any other harvest is fine on any of our reefs other than an oyster. That cost is paid by usually a cost share between us and an NGO. And they use all types of materials. They've even used large parts of old highways or bridges. AOC is relatively new to us. We have less than 10 active permits right now. We're still drafting or cleaning up language, changing legislative things to make it more better regulated. We have a big park that's dedicated to that down just north of Grand Isle. We're trying to get another one started, and we'll get one started, I believe, in Cameron, which is over in Calcasieu Lake. We also permit other things besides parks, and AOC covers everything. That's AOC. Cages, bags, rock racks, and all. I don't know if y'all have heard of the Shellevator, which is an innovation that's being done, at least down in the south part of the country. AOC, we hope gets bigger, and we've hired our first person to do really nothing but manage the AOC. She just came on within the last couple of weeks, but we're hoping it grows, and we need somebody to manage it better than all of us doing it part-time. And that kind of is the future. This is more my take on how the industry should go, but I like the AOC. It's a whole lot less burdensome on the taxpayer to come up with this money, other than BP, I guess. But a lot of it is the relief money. You're talking $2.5 million a coach plant, and that may last a week after it opens. So I like the AOC. The department is kind of pushing AOC as well. I like the investment. It's not so much on the state. So we've made brood reefs another part of the toolbox, so to speak. Is we envision maybe be able to build a chain of brood reefs along the coast, try to help produce get some reproduction that way. And there's also a new thing that I really don't know anything about, but it's oyster larval modeling is another tool that we're just beginning to use. So I'm done. That's as fast as I could go.
That is great, Ty. Thank you. I know it's a lot of information. There were a few questions. Carolina is working hard to answer them. Trying to think if there's anything you didn't answer.
Yes, I'm working on replying to some of those questions, and yeah, just let us know if I don't address them.
Okay.
Just I'm going slowly here.
Thank you.
Carolina is our Oyster program manager here, so she's responsible for the whole Oyster program, and I kind of work with her. It's kind of Oyster is just a big deal down here.
Gotcha. And is the AOC, that is aquaculture operation certificate, or?
It's just alternative oyster culture is what we call it,
Okay.
to capture all of it.
Gotcha. Okay. Thank you. Jason Peters had a question for you, Ty.
Hey, Ty, appreciate the talk, and a lot of similarities, I think, between the way Louisiana is doing things and the way North Carolina is doing things. Did have a question briefly, and it may be answered in the comments. How is Louisiana collecting square meter samples? Is that with divers or tongs, or how are you doing that?
It's divers. We don't employ tongs for our sampling. So the oyster stock assessment is 100% diving. We're just fortunate to have a lot of divers on staff. So
Cool. Thanks.
you're welcome.
Okay. Well, I think Ty worked hard to go short, so we'll go ahead and move on to the next one. Georgia, who do we have up next? Thank you, Ty.
You're welcome.
Yeah, thank you, Ty, so much. That was great. On our agenda next, we had Chris Judy from Maryland, but he is having access issues. He's getting a bad gateway error. I don't know if anybody here experienced with Zoom knows how to overcome a bad gateway, whether it's on our end or his. But we're going to go ahead, Ben, if you are ready, Ben Dyer from South Carolina, we're going to move forward with your presentation, and I can keep troubleshooting with Chris. He did send me his slides, so those will be shareable later on, but we'll work that out hopefully later on. So Ben, take it away. You should have all the permissions you need to get started.
Sure, thank you. Can everyone hear me? I'm sure I haven't been talking much in these. There's share screen. Let's see, screen. Make sure which screen I need. So that should have done it. Can everybody see that? Does that work?
No, we can't see your screen, Ben.
Ah, here we go.
There it goes. We got it.
Perfect. I appreciate the opportunity today to speak. Let me reorient here. Apologies. This has kicked me out of presenter view. Oh well, we'll make it work. So yeah, I am with the Office of Fisheries Management within the Marine Resource Division here in South Carolina, and oversee the shellfish management section, which oversees the recreational, commercial, harvest and resource management, as well as the shellfish mariculture management as well. We also do have an outreach component, and I'll kind of touch on that a little bit here in a second. It's not advanced. I'm sorry, I'm having technical difficulties here. There we go. Quickly orient you. I know most are familiar, but South Carolina, we have a lot of number of inlets, bays, sounds that lay to quite a large expanse of salt marsh here, and within that salt marsh it covers about 350,000 acres of salt marsh, making up about 2/3 of our coastal wetlands here in South Carolina. And there we go. Now I'm working. Obviously, within that salt marsh, we have our oyster reef resources. 95% of the resource within South Carolina is in the intertidal zone. We have a 6 to 8 foot tidal range, a diurnal tidal range here in South Carolina, going from north to south. And the predominant here is fringing reefs and patch reefs or flats, we call them as well. We are have quite a healthy recruitment here in South Carolina, ranging anywhere from about 2,000 to 4,000 spat set per square meter. So we are kind of substrate limited. So any kind of substrate we can put out can be very beneficial. Just kind of a touch on the history of the landings here in South Carolina. Not the biggest player, but at one point we did have quite a large landings here within a period of time. We did have 16 canneries within the state at one period. Those have all now closed down for different reasons, with the last one closing down in 1986. And now you can see that some of those landings have started to kind of level out and become more consistent. Just wanted to show kind of that high variability we had for quite a while. This is a more recent picture. You can see that that's that 2000 to current. And we have, this is the difference, and I'll touch base on this in different grounds and areas we have. But this is the wild harvest commercial landings. Not really going to touch on any mariculture today. But you can see we did have a little downturn due to COVID, but we're kind of back where we were in the normal range. The oyster commercial industry here in South Carolina is the 4th largest fishery in the state. This is just the X vessel value. This also does touch on the mariculture, which is about $1 million. $1 million. So the wild harvest is ranging in the 2.3, 2.4 million. And this is again just the X vessel value, which is kind of important here in South Carolina because 95% of the oysters harvested here stay within the state. So there is quite a large a bit of secondary value to the state, being retail, restaurants, things like that. So these are our grounds. We have so we have about 5,000 acres of mapped intertidal oyster reef in South Carolina. We do have some tidal resources, but it's quite small, and in fact those have been impacted over the years due to actually rediversions of canals and things. So and historically, I did want to mention, historically our harvest has been predominantly hand harvest and still is today. There's actually no mechanical harvest being permitted for oysters in quite some time. So of the intertidal resources, we have kind of 3 main ground areas. There is a 4th, but that is private ownership. Here in South Carolina, we have basically the state has rights from the high tide line down within our salt marshes and any resources there within it. So there's private leases or private areas that do claim those rights. So won't get into that today, and they're very few. We do not have riparian rights here in South Carolina. So the state retains all of that. And so we have culture grounds. Those are the letter C with the number behind it. And those are culture permits. Those are permits that we give out, 5-year permits for the commercial exclusive use of those areas. And with those permits comes rent and then oversight and requirements for husbandry. And I'll get into that in a minute, how they do that. And the onus is on the culture permit holder to do that husbandry. We have the recreational grounds. Those start with letter R, public. Those are recreationally only. We manage those areas. And then we also have state shellfish grounds, which we consider common grounds because they are actually both recreationally and commercially available. And we are essentially the culture permit holder or the culture managers for those state shellfish grounds. For commercial purposes, the only real two tools we have is to either open or close the ground. We can do that for the whole season or any kind of variation of time within the season. And then we plant shell. And when we plant culch material, we do that for the recreational harvest purpose. So some main ways that we create oyster habitat within South Carolina, we have I should say, we have a culture permit plantings. Again, touch on that in a second. The commercial harvest management, Some of those do actually plant on the state shellfish grounds, the common grounds, and they get extra credit for doing so as an incentive that helps us manage those areas. And then we have the recreational harvest management. That's the SCORE program, the South Carolina Oyster Recycling Enhancement Program. And we oversee that. Then the other three below that are, and the top two are for habitat that is harvested. And the bottom three are not necessarily sanctuary. We don't have any technically true sanctuary areas in South Carolina. So these are done on areas that are not harvestable, usually due to water quality issues that are closed down by the health department. So we have our community-based, which is an outreach. We do restoration that way. I'll touch on these very lightly, not very much, but throughout the presentation. And we have mitigation plantings for any kind of adverse impacts that companies might have. And then we also have individual grant funded projects. Those are kind of go and come as we get those opportunities. Mostly right now, the hot button topic is coastal resiliency. So to touch on the culture permit management, some cultivations. We have we either have cultivation, which is not really creation, but the cultivation methods where they rake down. They'll actually go out and physically rake down or drag kind of a mesh link chain across, and that helps cultivate the product, and then as well as cull in place. So when they harvest, they'll actually cull down some of the material, knock the smaller oysters off, and can help cultivate that way. Then we have habitat creation that we oversee, where they're required to plant 50 bushels per acre of their permit. And we directly oversee that and manage it. We either will be in person to oversee that, or have strict requirements where they can document it so we can then verify it. But all planting is verified, and they have a requirement that if they don't meet, then they will have their permit revoked. We allow for cured shell. There's green shell, which is essentially a method. Sometimes they'll cull in place, but then when they take it back to their processing facility, they'll break it down even further. And any smaller oysters that fall off that, they'll take it back out. Seed, plantings, and then relay. Essentially, they can take from one area to another. And when they do that, they're actually culling in place and then taking it usually from an area that is poor water quality into an area that's improved. And then we also, because shell is such a tough commodity to come by, we allow for alternative culture materials, and I'll have some examples of those in a second. I allow for tomato stakes, bamboo stakes, crab traps modified, obviously, to not fish anymore, mesh wire, and those have very strict regulations and rules. We can do that under a general permit that we've been authorized under the Army Corps of Engineers, and they have set amounts that they equate to for a certain amount of culture bushels planted, and they have very strict requirements that they have to meet, again with oversight from us. And here's just some quick examples. There's this is not every example that I just mentioned, but you can see they're quite effective, actually, due to our high recruitment rates. So on the top left we have excuse me, bamboo stakes, and then on the top right, that's not the exact same location, but that's very similar to what it would look like after about 3 to 5 years. And the bottom left is actually a crab traps and the wire mesh. Again, very strict ways that they have to adhere to, but then it's very effective. And you can see on the bottom right, that's kind of a several years later of crab traps. So shellfish habitat, this is specific to state shellfish grounds, moving on from culture permits. So the state shellfish ground management, again, we do it for recreational plantings, but we also have commercial harvest. So the state shellfish ground system, previously we had leases, large leases that were owned by just a small amount of people. And in 1986, there was a kind of sweeping legislation to allow for these state shellfish grounds, these common areas, to help incentivize entry into the commercial fishery, and then also allow for a larger areas of recreational available grounds. And so to date now, it's kind of quite equal, between culture permits. The PSGs, those are recreationally only. Those are set in law. We can't we can't make them go away or make any more. So essentially the state shellfish grounds, we can just close them commercially, and we do so in some areas to allow for recreationally only harvesting. So from the Department of Natural Resources standpoint, when we have our planting program, which is primarily funded by our saltwater fishing license revenue funds, to date, that started back in the turn of the century. So about 2000, we've planted over 775,000 bushels and it's created about 76 acres. We annually plant around 43,000 bushels. Challenge we have though is we plant more shell than we recycle. We actually do have a quite healthy recycling program. If there's time, I don't want to run up too much time, but if there's time, I can touch on the recycling program as well if people are interested. And again, this is only on the state shellfish grounds and the public shellfish grounds, areas that are available for recreational harvest. So some of those methods, 99% of the time, we're using what we call large scale plantings, or pretty much what everybody else does is we have a barge. The department has its own 60-foot barge, seen here with and that we utilize. We have scientific methods that we've derived through studies looking at the different variables. When we go at low tide, we can kind of see those. We stake them. I don't know if you can see it in that picture, but there's a kind of a small PVC pole out in the marsh. We'll stake out the area, and then we can come back at high tide, plant over it that way. The bottom right is some of our community-based plantings. We do use some of that sometimes, depending on the funding source, in some areas that are harvestable, but it's very, very rare. That's pretty much used in areas that are not available for harvest. So again, just a little bit more pictures of large scale. The top left is DNR's barge. This is how we load it. The ramp on the front allows us to be real flexible. You saw the expanse of kind of our coastline, so we can be kind of nimble in some of these smaller tidal creeks and areas. Plus we can pull up to public boat landings, load the shell up fairly quickly within about an hour, and then we can be out. The bottom right is contractor. We also use a contracted barge in some of our further away from our areas, further down south, further up north. And using this method, again, 35 to 80,000 bushels, that's including the mitigation that we do. So apologize for all the different numbers. It's kind of piecemealing some of these pictures together, but we usually create about 4 to 8 acres every year. This is what we do every year on average total for the large scale plantings, anywhere from these numbers. Again, just a quick slide to show the recruitment rates and the spat set that we do get. Quite lucky in those regards. So we get from just one shell, we can get quite a number of growth. Just some quick examples of some plantings that we do. The few years later, these are all assessments. I'll get into touch on a slide on monitoring. Again, pre-planting, these are fringe reefs 2 years later. This is some of our community-based plantings, and this is kind of where we would utilize these plantings, since it's either bag shell or some type of other manufactured wire reef. Sorry, I don't have slides on that right now, but I'm happy to answer questions. But they're better utilized in areas of high energy zones, such as this. So you can see here how quite effective it is in kind of protecting that marsh habitat. So monitoring of all of our plantings, once they are planted, we go back 1, 2, and 3 years later. We do quantitative and qualitative assessments. We'll take quadrat samples, quarter meter samples. We measure them. We can get growth rates, recruitment rates, size demographics. We utilize this to change any BMPs that we might have for plantings. That's allowed us to have about an 80% success rate in some of our all of our plantings. We do have a standard footprint loss just to the mud that we have here and how it can silt and sediment over with the tides. But our metrics that we use, we can have a pretty successful planting rate. And so if there's time, I'll touch on the recycling program. I don't want to take up other people's time. If that works, yes, no, I can stop here.
I think we've got enough time. Georgia, is that okay?
Yeah, go ahead, Ben.
Yeah.
Okay, it's just a couple slides. I don't know. I apologize if this is outside the scope of this work group, but it's a large part of where we get our shell from. Since we plant about 43,000 bushels a year, this is 3/4 of the shell we get is where we get from our recycling program. So it was initiated in 1999. Since then, almost 500 or over 450,000 bushels, and annually we get about 32,000 bushels every year. The challenge is we're only capturing about 12%. So again, I know this is a big topic with this group is shell availability. And I did want to say that we predominantly and historically have planted just oyster shells. We only just the last 2 years started to use, I know I touched on alternative culture materials for culture permit plantings and things like that, but for the state's part in the large scale planting in the last 2 years, we've only really started to incorporate limestone. And it's only been about 20% of the shell that or the amount of material we put out in the last 2 years. So the recapturing the shell is kind of a big internal push that we'd like to continue. Here's kind of the quick graph of recycling. We get it from public drop-off locations. We actually collect directly from restaurants, and we also have events and caterers. We have 30 public drop-offs in 12 different counties throughout the state. This is what they might look like. Public can come and bring their shell to us. We do restaurant recycling. We have a kind of a mechanism that we can go around and collect shell. We also utilize volunteers to help collect in some remote areas from the restaurants. They'll come and bring them to our public drop-offs where we can utilize larger equipment to pick it up. And then, of course, once we recycle the shell, we then quarantine it for 6 months, and get rid of any invasive species, any oyster pathogens, things like that. So thank you for your time. I appreciate it. That is all I have.
Thank you, Ben. That was very great. That was great. I think South Carolina, Nancy Hadley and Dr. Lauren Cohen, I think they were the model of shell recycling for all the different states that have picked it up since then. I think they were on the forefront. We've all copied South Carolina's model and done different things. So we appreciate everything you all are doing. We had one question. What is your standard? What do you consider your pounds per bushel? North Carolina is 55 pounds. Do you have a standard weight for your bushels?
For shucked oyster shells?
Yeah.
We use 50 only because when we weigh them out, a lot of our oyster shells is mixed between South Carolina shells or intertidal shells and Gulf shells. And so we met at the happy medium. Gulf shells, we did measure at about, I say Gulf, apologies, but subtidal shells, we did measure at about 55 pounds, 55 to 60, and we kept it at 55. And then intertidal shells were about 47, 46. So we meet the middle since a lot of our shell is mixed.
Perfect. Any other questions for Ben? One question I had is with the limestone, one of the things we're seeing in higher salinity in North Carolina is the prevalence of boring sponge coming in. Have you seen that yet with I know you're intertidal, it's more of a subtidal thing, but have you seen that at all in your plant?
If we plant too low, yes, definitely. One thing we did, and like you alluded to, is we're predominantly in the intertidal. We kind of will go out at specifically when we do assess pre-planting areas to do site selection. We'll go at a 0 or negative tide, and to know exactly where that threshold is going to be, and try to stay within that. But we definitely have boring sponges, which is one of the main reasons we don't have a large subtidal resource here. I mean, that is the main reason, really. But one thing we did find out, and it kind of might be pertinent to this group, is unknowingly we purchased, and since we're new at this, this might be well known, and I might be showing my ignorance with limestone here. But apparently there's quite a difference, and we had purchased some to do research and standardization methods here before we wanted to put it out large scale. And that started off with just small recruitment trays, and it did really well. It did, in some places, almost did equal or better than our oyster shells. And then we did some small plot studies, and in those small plot studies, we sourced shell from a different quarry that was a little closer, and it was still marine grade shell, but apparently it did not recruit very well. And come to find out, we sent it to our geologists, and they started looking at it, and it had different components of silica and quartz predominantly, instead of the calcium carbonate. And due to its age, they started aging it, and it was instead of millions and millions of years old, it was only like a million, so there was some difference there, and it really affected us. And like I said, I might be saying something that's quite well known in this company, but I just, before I forget, that was kind of an important lesson we learned.
Yeah, that is something that I had not known. I don't know if our state biologists have been working on that or not, but that's something interesting. Any other questions for Ben? Otherwise, we'll move on. Thank you again, Ben. Georgia, did Chris Judy get it? There he is. Yep.
Yes, Chris is with us. He made it in. I apologize to anybody else who has also joined the call that might have had connection issues. We're trying to work that out. Maybe some network connection came back while we were on the call. But Chris, go ahead and take your time. Try to share your screen. Let me know if I need to share your slides, but you should have all the permissions you need, so go right ahead.
Okay, let me give this a try. Entire screen. Can you see that presentation?
Not yet, Chris.
Okay, well, how about you show my presentation?
Okay.
Because I've had computer issues for the last 30 minutes. Good. All right, and if you don't mind making that full screen, that would help.
Everybody can see that okay? All right.
I think there is a full screen button down below my first slide somewhere, I thought. Well, I'll just start talking, and because a few slides may be hard to read if it's that small. Well, thank you all for the opportunity here. I'm Chris Judy with the Shellfish Division in Maryland. We also have some folks on the call. I think Jody, Lorinda, and Frank. They've been very helpful in preparing this information. So, that helps a whole lot. Thank you. So I'll actually spring off some comments I've already heard. So if I had to give you maybe 30 seconds of the picture in Maryland, maybe just this is your main take-home message. We're predominantly a public fishery. We do have aquaculture, but it's predominantly a public fishery. Aquaculture is growing. That's good to see, but it is less of an entity in Maryland so far. And in terms of harvest, again, we have mostly a public fishery, very little recreational fishery. We have some, but not of any real significance. And in terms of sanctuaries, I think some states don't have any or have a few. We have a very large sanctuary program. You'll see that soon. Significant efforts in terms of money and seed and habitat. So that's a keynote of Maryland's activities. And I saw, I think, a pie chart or something in a previous presentation on percentages of bottom. And here's some numbers for Maryland in the big picture. 76% of our bottom habitat is basically in the fishery areas, and approximately 24% in the sanctuary areas. So in terms of bottom, it looks like the fishery has the largest share of the resources, so to speak. And in acreage wise, it does have a lot of acreage. But in terms of money and resources, you'll see there's a tremendous effort in the sanctuary program. We have a shell recycling effort in Maryland. I saw some great slides there from South Carolina, almost ditto on the pictures. We have restaurant locations, community locations, etc. Our shell recycling isn't run by the state. It's done by different organizations that work with oysters, nonprofit organizations. Okay, next slide, please. That was the large overview if you happen to not catch the details coming up. Well, the Shellfish Division, I'll start here. I'm with the Shellfish Division, as are the other people on this call from Maryland. We have basically a three-pronged focus in our division: the public fishery, sanctuaries, and monitoring. And on the right-hand side are the various activities that are involved in all of these things: regulations, policies, plantings. We have harvest limits, a season, etc., bushel limits, various surveys, a stock assessment. We work with committees and commissions and so on, so forth, so forth. And in the small print, we also do a few things with clams. So that's the picture of the Shellfish Division, a strong three-pronged focus that you see there. Next, please. In terms of the state of Maryland, moving outside just the division that I represent, in terms of Maryland, oyster management can be envisioned as a three-legged stool. A lot of our partners refer to it this way. Basically, oyster management is supported by sanctuaries, aquaculture, and the public fishery. And we do have a lot of contentiousness, I guess you could say, in Maryland. There's a lot of cooperation. I want to emphasize that. We do work together, have a lot of diverse groups, but there are occasions where, say, one leg of the stool will think it should only be that. Another leg would think perhaps it should only be that leg. So we do have individuals that will stand out, but most people see this as a cooperative project where you need the three legs to have wise and proper oyster management. And that's how we view it here at the state of Maryland. Next, please. In terms of aquaculture, which this is, I think, the only slide, because most of what I'm going to present is the public fishery and sanctuaries. In terms of aquaculture, which is not under the Shellfish Division, we have a totally separate aquaculture division. You can see here the increase in harvest. We had some drastic changes, beneficial changes in 2010 to our aquaculture laws. It expanded and enhanced aquaculture in Maryland, and you can see the increase. In 2021 or so, we have 90,000 bushels harvested. I'll go through pretty quickly on these slides. You can read the details later and see what those three different color bars are. So the point is, it's a growing fishery, growing industry, 90,000 bushels recently. That's a significant increase from when it began in the 2010 law change. But I do not want this to be, say, your impression of aquaculture in Maryland, that it started in 2010 and perhaps we never had aquaculture before. What's missing from this slide is perhaps 30, 40, 50, even 100 years prior to this, we did have aquaculture. We had a robust private fishery. We had hundreds of thousands of bushels harvested, but disease, MSX and Dermo, just crippled the aquaculture industry in Maryland and the public fishery through the 1980s, the 1990s, and into the early 2000s. So this graph, what it does, this graph represents the resurgence of a long historical activity in aquaculture. Next, please. In terms of the public fishery, you can see the numbers are significantly higher. On the far right lower corner, you can see the aquaculture harvest at 90,000 bushels. The public fishery harvest with what we call oystermen, watermen, ranges between 100,000 to 400,000 bushels typically. Recently, it peaked up above 500,000. And these are fairly significant. Anything, let me say this, anything above 300,000 is pretty significant in the near term, go back 10, 15, 20 years. But prior to this graph, there's a history to every graph, of course. Prior to this graph, we were at 1 million and 2 million bushels of harvest before those disease episodes eroded the population of oysters in Maryland. But this is the recent trend, and we're up to 500,000. And we think it's going to obviously, well, to us, it's obvious. It would dip down to 400 and 300 as harvest occurs. Maybe we have a bad spat set. So we don't think 500 is sustainable long-term, but this is going to be we think the future oscillation. Basically 200 to 400 is a standard routine with some peaks up to 5. Next, please. In terms of our management, we manage by a season. So we set the days of the week. We have bushel limits based on different gear types. The picture here shows patent tongs. We have skipjack sailing dredges. We have power dredges, diving, hand tonging. So we have different limits for different gear types. And they're set annually based on information from our oyster stock assessment. We also have a licensing system. And with oysters, it's a little bit, maybe different from your regular waterman in Maryland. We have a licensing system where you can get a license that allows you to crab, clam, fish, etc. You can do it all. But to oyster, you need an extra, what we call surcharge on your license. So if you're a licensed waterman with one of these all-inclusive licenses, you cannot oyster until you pay the surcharge. So the point here in this second set of bullets, we have 800 to over 1,000 oyster surcharges annually over the last 10 years. So in any given year, you might have 800 or 900 or 1,000 watermen holding that surcharge. But if you look at the small print right there at the bottom there, it says there's about 3,000 commercial licenses that could potentially harvest oysters if they paid the surcharge. And some nuances here are important. We're not suggesting that we're going to have 3,000 oystermen in Maryland. Some oystermen don't want, some watermen don't want to oyster. They crab, they fish, have no interest in oystering. Others make money crabbing and fishing. They might have some slight interest in oystering, but they opt not to. So the point is, we're not going to have 3,000 watermen rushing to oyster. We have a select group that are interested in it, committed to it. They have the gear for it. So on a year-by-year basis, we see about 800 to a little over 1,000 surcharges being bought. And that's the pool of people who can oyster. Then at the bottom, the note is that harvest is allowed in all open areas. We have many different areas available for harvest. We can close them. They're generally open. We might close areas, for example, based upon a recommendation from one of our county oyster committees. They might say, we have some areas here, maybe 3 or 5, 6 areas, whatever. We'd like them to be closed until the oysters have grown large enough. And sometimes they actually say, let's keep it closed even after the oysters have reached the 3-inch legal size. We'd like to get some extra growth. So we do work with our county oyster committees to open and close areas. But generally, most of the oyster bottom in Maryland is open. We only close some areas in conversation with these committees. Next, please. In terms of public fishery bottom, we have over 1,000 oyster bars and basically over 248,000 acres that are not sanctuary. So we have a lot of acres available to harvest, but I'm sure it's true in your state, oysters don't carpet the bottom from one shore to the next. So if you're in a river, you've got mud bottom, you've got sand bottom. Oysters don't grow here. Oysters grow in certain areas, whether they be reef or bars, depending on your state. So of the 248,000 acres, they are not all populated by oysters. Watermen target certain discrete areas that we call oyster bars. In terms of the fishery and plantings, since 2010, we have approximately over 1.5 million bushels of what we call fresh shells. Other states call them green. These are the freshly shucked oyster shells. So we have over 1.5 million bushels of fresh shells planted. We see over 160,000 bushels of natural seed in this period from 2010, and about 2.3 billion hatchery spat have been planted in this time period. All of this for the public fishery. Next, please. This graph shows a broad view from 84 forward. It just follows the general trend of the bars. I won't get into all the different colors. You can absorb that later, a lot of details. So what you see is aggressive shell planting through 1984 to 2004, and actually the graph could go back to 1960. We've had that program for a long time. But in around 2004, 2006, the program ended. So then we started to rely basically on fresh shells from the shucking industry. So this large cache of shells we had, and you see 3, 4, 5 million bushels planted per year, that ended. Now we're looking at just shucking house shells, maybe in the tune of 200,000 plus or minus bushels a year. That's our shell supply now compared to what this graph shows historically. Next, please. In terms of some funding details, the public fishery, for the public fishery, we have a shell and seed planting program. Before I get into the details, note that numerous areas in Maryland get a spat set, not as high as South Carolina. We're very envious. We might have 40 spat per bushel, 50, 100, maybe 300 spat per bushel, but not thousands. So my point here is the public fishery is driven by natural recruitment. Nature provides the spat, they grow up, they provide market oysters, but we have this program of shelling and seeding to augment, and this is important to get, we augment the fishery with these plantings. The fishery is not entirely supported by these plantings. The fishery is driven by Mother Nature and the spat sets and the spat that grow to market size. So in terms of shell and seed plantings to augment the fishery, we're looking at $1 million to a little over $2 million a year in state funding. We have some different sources. There's $1 per bushel tax on every bushel harvested. And if oysters are exported out of state, perhaps to South Carolina, maybe you've used some Maryland shells, it's 30 cents a bushel export tax. We have a lot of bushels exported to Virginia, to a shucker down there. There's that surcharge fee I mentioned, a $300 charge if a license holder wants to actually go oyster. He has to pay that extra $300. And we have a grant from the Maryland Department of Transportation. Also, these oystermen and watermen associations will hold fundraisers, and they might gather $5,000, $10,000 or so, maybe more. So there's additional funding available. Next slide, please. Shifting gears from the fishery to sanctuaries, here's the sanctuary budget information, and then I'll show you a couple slides. We have a large scale and a small scale sanctuary effort. The large scale effort involves seeding and substrate plantings. You'll see what I mean by substrate in a minute. So in terms of funding, huge amounts of funding for the large scale sanctuary effort, $65 million to date over the course of, let's see, about 2012, about 10 years. And there's the distribution by agencies, mostly state funded. Our small scale sanctuary programs are funded to the tune of around $250,000 a year. We have a community-based Marylanders Grow Oysters program, oyster gardening. We help fund it. And then we have different groups like environmental organizations, foundations, et cetera, that do build a reef projects with reef balls and spat, et cetera. Next, please. We're going to move to some details on the sanctuaries. Like I said, we have a very large sanctuary commitment. We have 51 sanctuaries in Maryland. And I didn't acquaint you with the maps we've been showing. This is the Maryland part of the Chesapeake Bay plus the Potomac River. 51 sanctuaries as of 2010. And a quick historical note, prior to 2010, which is when we expanded our sanctuary program, we had maybe half a dozen, and they were small, 100 acres or less. Now we have entire rivers or large portions of rivers, et cetera. So back to the large scale and small scale. The large scale restoration projects are in 5 distinct sanctuaries. You'll see some details soon. The small scale restoration efforts are in a couple of the sanctuaries, It's part of the 46 others. We have 51 total. But most of the 46 other sanctuaries are actually left to nature. So nature is providing a spat set, or perhaps not. Nature is allowing oysters to grow, or perhaps not if there's a disease outbreak. So the point of our sanctuary program is we have a huge commitment to 5 of the 51. We have a small commitment to a few of the other 46, but most of the other 46 are under nature's control. Next, please. If you look at the bottom, that's the big take-home message. I'll mention what's at the top in a minute. In Maryland, we have over 900 acres that have been what we call initially restored. That means they've received their habitat and they've received the first dose of seeding. So if you think maybe of the COVID vaccines, you get your first and then you get your second. So in terms of these sanctuaries, these 5 big sanctuaries, they've received their first dose of seed. And then a few years later, if needed, they'll get a second dose. So 900 acres have had that initial effort. And that means over 5 billion hatchery spat have been planted. Now, we all know, because we work with oysters, when you take almost microscopic hatchery spat and put them in the natural system, all 5.5 billion won't live to become even a 1-inch oyster, let alone 3 or 4 or 5-inch oysters. So there's a large mortality, 90% plus. But when you plant so many, even though you have a high mortality, you are left with large amounts of oysters in these sanctuaries. And the comment at the top is Maryland had a firm, solid commitment made in 2014 to do 5 large projects in Maryland. Some of these started before the 2014 commitment, but that commitment solidified our efforts toward these 5 sanctuaries. Next, please. So some pictures. These pictures will serve, I guess, 2 purposes, really. What they're showing here are the restoration treatment efforts in sanctuaries. The crane will plant stone. The big bucket will move back and forth and spread the stone on the bottom, creating a layer. We don't want large piles because a boat could run into them. Then you see the hatchery tanks on the upper right. Shells are put in the tanks, larvae are added, and we produce spat on shell. Those spat on shell are loaded on boats. The boat goes to the planting ground, washes the spat off with a gentle fire hose so we don't damage the oysters. And there on the lower left, you can see what the oysters look like after a month or 2 of growth. So this is the general approach for sanctuaries. We put down some stone habitat if it's needed. On top of that stone habitat, spat are planted. The stone acts as a substrate so the spat can live up in the water column and obviously grow. The goal is actually for the stone to eventually be, say, insignificant, meaning the oysters would grow generation after generation and make clumps, I guess like you saw in South Carolina. And the idea would be to have a living veneer of oysters on top of the stone, and the stone ultimately wouldn't even be visible anymore. So let's see. The slides, or this slide, also serves the purpose of, in the public fishery, we have hatchery technology, just as is pictured here, producing spat on shell, which go on boats, as is pictured here, and are planted on harvest bars. But we're not yet planting stone on harvest bars. So in terms of harvest plantings, etc., these pictures illustrate a few of those activities too. Next slide. And I have just a few more, I think. Large-scale restoration results. We monitor them at 3 years and 6 years. It's called the 3-year check-in, the 6-year check-in. And in terms of the 6-year-old reefs for the sanctuary program, 99% meet the minimum oyster density criteria, which is basically 15 oysters per square meter. 83% of the reefs meet the higher target, which is 50 oysters per square meter, and 100% of the reefs are showing multiple year classes and an abundant amount of shell, which obviously is important. So we're seeing success with our reefs. What we still need to see is that when these brood oysters spawn, they're 3 years old and 6, et cetera, they're large brood oysters. We're still waiting to see, and it's hard to demonstrate, of course, because you can't track larvae. But the question in Maryland is, will this large commitment to sanctuaries yield an increase in oysters far field away from the sanctuaries? So can the sanctuaries help repopulate the harvest areas to get to the bottom line? So that's what we'll be looking for over the years. Next, please. We have a monitoring program. In the fall, we conduct a dredge survey. We go around the state. I was doing that yesterday, trying to outcompete with a loud diesel engine. So if my voice sounds rough, I apologize. The fall survey is ongoing. We do it every year. You can read the reports, very informative with a lot of information. We also do patent tong surveys. Similarly, they're written up. We have reports on those. And all these surveys quantify oyster survival, spat set, habitat quality, et cetera. And then, as I mentioned, in the large scale restoration program, we monitor it 3 and 6 years. We actually contract that out. Next, please. For the fall survey, just a special mention or two. We do it every year. It's a wealth of data. We monitor primarily spat set. We express it as spat per bushel. We look at disease levels, mortality levels, and the biomass, how big and the oyster meat is, not the shells, but the meat. And the biomass index has been increasing recently, so that's good news. There's the link to our reports. Feel free to check them out. Next, please. One product of the reports, we make a lot of different maps and graphs, et cetera, to summarize the data. And this just shows one page from the report. This is the spat set results in Maryland. The red shows the higher spat set, the blue the lower, and the other colors in between. So this is one product that we have that educates us, the public, and everyone else about where the spat set is good, poor, and in the middle. Next, please. The oyster stock assessment is a new activity in Maryland. These are results from the 2020 stock assessment. This is a number of years old in terms of something that we've done. We didn't have this for decades and decades in the past. The stock assessment provides an oyster population estimate. These are the different main regions of the bay. There you can see our estimated oyster population in the tune of, well, I'm trying to read the graph, millions, so 3,000 times a million. So we have this estimate. You can see it's declined. It went up some, leveled off, and then has peaked again. We noticed, obviously, that good spat sets will generate higher population estimates. Of course, mortality events would cause a lower amount, freshet mortality, et cetera. So this population stock assessment is used in management. It guides management. It's not something that we just blindly follow. We have other data sources that we look at as well. But if you want to see any information on our stock assessment, we have pages and pages and pages of information and graphs. Next, please. Lessons learned. This was one of the key questions that came out in the emails. So in terms of our large scale sanctuary program, a couple quick lessons. We can save on money as we monitor the seed plantings. If we're seeing good results from the first dose of seed that was planted, good survival, good densities, we don't have to replant every acre. We can save by not planting certain areas, and that reduces the budget. And at the same time, we meet our goals. We also find that higher resolution as we do our pre-restoration surveys is important. If you don't take enough samples and you think a particular area needs a certain type of treatment, stones or seed or whatever it might be, you're actually somewhat in a fog. So the point is, by increasing the resolution, getting more data, you more finely can see what's happening on the bottom, and you can save money by knowing more about what's down there. Another take-home lesson, when we planted stones in the very first tributary, some high spots were created accidentally, and ships hit or boats hit them, and that was obviously a problem. So We want to provide deeper water clearance above the substrate. We don't want to make high spots. We want to keep the water clear for boat traffic. And then lastly, planting density. The amount of spat versus the amount of shell is important on the bottom. We have a lot of details if any of this is of interest to you. Now, still to be learned, and these are really maybe the most important aspects of this slide. What are the long-term impacts to the ecosystem with these living reefs on the bottom now? What tributary-wide benefits do we see? We know there are benefits for the area that's planted. Say it's a 5-acre area. We know that's a better place. We know what's happening in terms of nutrient reduction, the different organisms that inhabit the site, et cetera. But what's happening on the tributary wide scale, because we have these different plantings on the bottom. Still to be learned are the far field effects. Are the sanctuaries actually increasing spat sets elsewhere? The premise, the say underpinnings of our sanctuary program is, think of it this way: a high tide floats all boats. So if the sanctuaries can produce enough larvae, which are distributed well enough, where other areas are populated with new spat, oyster populations can increase not only in the sanctuaries, but outside as well. So are the sanctuaries going to perform in the future to help the rest of the bay? And we need to monitor that the best we can and keep track of it. The difficulty obviously is you don't always know, or you perhaps never know, where the larvae came from that yielded a spat set in a harvest area. Can you say the sanctuary here helped the harvest area over there? That's yet to be determined. If we could show that type of relationship, it would really help, because watermen here in Maryland are resistant to sanctuaries. And if we had something more tangible to say, this sanctuary has helped your harvest area increase production, we would win more allies, obviously, in the sanctuary effort. Let's see, future projects. We have a couple projects. We're trying to conduct a new bay bottom survey. The last one was done 40 years ago. So we're trying to get more information, up-to-date information on our bay bottom status, the shell bottom versus the mud versus the sand, et cetera. And I think that might be it. So my last comment would be, this was a broad overview. We could provide, as you can too, to us, pages of information, slide after slide, map after map on any one of these topics. So if you have any interest, need any more info, we can send you more details. This was just the surface of what we're doing here in Maryland. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Chris, and your team. Really appreciate you all putting all that information together. And we did have a question about, sharing of the slides and things like that and presentations. And Georgia did answer that, but just to make sure everyone could see it. We will be making sure all the presentations are available. Any information that's shared, any emails back and forth with more questions, we'll put all that together. We have the North Carolina Oyster Restoration site, and we're trying to upload all the information to there. So as soon as we get that there, as well as the list of participants, any other information, we'll let you know, but we are working on that. Chris, there was one question in the chat regarding how high were the spots that were knocked down by the boats, but they're having some issues like that in Louisiana, just kind of how you fixed it and those kind of things.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for bringing that up. That's right. I raised my hand because I saw the note there. Before I get to that, the slides that I'll provide will actually have about 20 more slides. So you'll have a lot of extra detail compared to what I could do today. All right. So in terms of the high spots, and I'll make this a short story. So they were high enough where instead of the necessary 6 feet of clearance above the stones that we put overboard, we only had 4. And on a low tide, it could be even less. So these were serious high spots, not just little undulations on the bottom. These were large. They were maybe the size of, say, 20 feet by 20 feet, projecting enough out of the bottom to only provide 4 feet of water clearance. So that's a lot of stones. What we did is we took a small barge that the state owned with a small crane, And the high spot was buoyed. So just think of like a connect the dot project. Put 5 or 6 buoys around the high spot. You've encircled it. And now the crane operator would simply grab stones from within that buoyed area and put them on the barge. After maybe 10 minutes of work, we would survey it with a small boat, and we would see where it needed more correction and more, et cetera. So it was just nibbling away at the high spot to remove it and put it on a barge. When we knew we were done is when the small boat going back and forth across the area saw that it was as level as the rest of the area, and we had our 6 foot of clearance. So think of a 5-acre area with maybe 10 high spots spread throughout. And we just went to each high spot, buoyed it, and removed it. Now, what we did with the stones, because now we have all these stones, we went to a deeper area of our restoration site. Let's say it was 10 feet deep. And then we broadcast the stones still within the permitted area. We had to work within the area we had a permit for. We would broadcast the stones in the deeper water. It would add maybe 3 inches of depth to the stones, but we still had, say, 9 feet of water clearance. So that's what we did to remove those high spots. And we had a few, boat groundings, a few claims through the insurance company, et cetera. So if you need more details, let me know. You can email me.
Thanks, Chris.
Chris, this is Todd Miller in North Carolina. I was curious in your graph about with the stock assessment, it looked like the Choptank River was a very large percentage of the increased population. Is that because of the sanctuary program or?
Well, cause and effect, we don't know, but I'll mention this. The Choptank region that you saw in the stock assessment is a huge area. It's the Choptank River, Broad Creek, Harris Creek, Tread Avon, et cetera, et cetera. So just in terms of acres of oyster bars, it's a huge area, a lot of oysters. Whereas if you notice the really skinny yellow area, that was the Severn and maybe South River or Road River. The Severn River is one tiny river. So one, the Choptank showed up significantly on the graph because it's just a large area, and therefore it's going to show a large result. But also the Choptank has good spat sets. Harris Creek, Broad Creek has good spat sets. The lower Choptank can as well. We just recently did our survey up there, and the upper Choptank had a good spat set. So the point here is not only in addition to the huge size of it contributing to its presence on the graph, but also it has a lot of oysters. And when there is a good spat set, that large area responds. You know, we see the response in our data.
Okay, thank you.
But cause and effect, we don't know yet.
Okay.
Any other questions for Chris or his team? Lots of great information. Thank you, Chris. We appreciate it. Well, we really appreciate everyone's time in preparing these presentations and sharing in the chat and the conversations. As I mentioned, we'll be trying to pool all these resources so they're available for you. We'll let you know as soon as that happens. Georgia will also be reaching out to you to see who is able to actually attend in person the workshop at the Restore America's Estuaries Conference in December, just so we have sort of numbers and to make sure we're prepared for that. And then we'll be pulling together some of the key points. We'll be working with Jason and Abby with the Division of Marine Fisheries here in North Carolina to kind of pull together some of the main kind of common threads or questions or kind of more information needed out of what everyone's presented so far, and helping to pull that into the workshop agenda. And we'll share that with you all as well, so that you can provide feedback on that. So any other questions about, we hope that you'll certainly be able to come. There's a few details we're working out. We are going to live stream it, working with Restore America's Estuaries to figure out whether you have to pay for the day to be able to live stream it or not. And we'll let you know probably within a week or so about that. But we hope that you'll either be able to attend in person or live stream. And again, anything that's produced during that workshop, we will make sure it's available electronically to anybody who wants it. But if anybody has any other questions or anything, just let us know. You've got our emails, but we really appreciate you sticking through the 3 seminars. Lots of great information. I know I've learned a tremendous amount and have a lot more questions. We'll be pulling all this together and sharing it with you so that we can have a really productive meeting and discussion moving forward. But thank you all very much for your time and we really appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone. We'll speak to you soon.